Gail Russell didn't vanish beneath flashbulbs or a screaming headline. Her ending arrived in a silence so complete that Hollywood barely noticed it had happened. No cameras, no crowd, no desperate last interview. Just a life that had been fading for a long time, and a system that had already stopped looking. In this story, the quiet itself is the cruelty. How does a star disappear before she's even gone? And who gets to decide when someone is no longer worth saving? On screen, Gail looked like the kind of beauty the Golden Age loved to frame. Soft, luminous, almost breakable. Off-screen, that same fragility was treated like a flaw to manage, not a human being to protect. The industry didn't need a villain. It had schedules, contracts, and a simple question that sounded harmless until it wasn't. Can she still perform? If fame is supposed to be a reward, why did it feel like a trap? And if the phone stops ringing, does that mean you've failed or that you've been erased? Tonight, we're opening the door on a tragedy Hollywood didn't witness because it had already turned away. Gail Russell looked like someone Hollywood should have known how to protect. On camera, her beauty was quiet and restrained, the kind that did not conquer a room but softened it, drawing the viewer closer without demanding attention. She appeared vulnerable in a way that felt sincere rather than theatrical, as if the camera had stumbled upon a private emotion instead of capturing a performance. The Golden Age adored faces like hers, gentle features, expressive eyes, a presence rooted in feeling rather than dominance. Audiences leaned toward her, sensing something fragile and human behind the image. Yet Hollywood itself required the opposite. It demanded endurance, visibility, and the ability to withstand constant scrutiny without hesitation. From the beginning, Gail Russell lacked the instinct to armor herself against that gaze, and this absence quietly marked her as someone who would struggle to survive the world surrounding her. She did not command space or project authority when she entered a room. She did not know how to perform confidence once the cameras stopped rolling. While other actresses learned how to turn charm into currency and attention into leverage, Gail withdrew from it. Silence did not empower her. It unsettled her. Being watched did not enlarge her sense of self. It stripped it bare. She existed through emotion rather than control, through sensitivity rather than force. The very vulnerability that made her magnetic on screen left her exposed everywhere else. Hollywood rewards those who know how to convert attention into protection, but Gail absorbed attention until it became weight. In an industry built on presence, her disappearance was already taking shape long before anyone noticed. This was not a question of talent or ambition, but of incompatibility between a person and a system that mistook visibility for strength. Even at the height of her recognition, there was something provisional about Gail Russell, as if she never fully believed she was meant to remain where she stood. Fame seemed to happen around her rather than belong to her, and she did not build defenses against the demands that inevitably followed. She did not cultivate power, strategy, or distance. That lack of armor was not a failure of will, it was her nature. Hollywood romanticizes fragility only when it can be contained, controlled, and switched off at the end of a scene. Gail embodied a fragility that lingered beyond the set, following her into every space the industry demanded she occupy. The system did not know how to protect someone like that, so it continued forward without adjusting its pace. It framed her beauty, used her presence, and quietly ignored the cost. Gail Russell did not fail to become a star. She became exactly what Hollywood wanted on screen. What she could never become was the kind of person required to survive everything that came with it. From the very start, her story carried the sense of an ending that would arrive without noise or resistance. There was no instinct to fight the system, no urge to dominate it, and no illusion that compliance would guarantee safety. She moved through Hollywood as someone passing through hostile territory, hoping sensitivity might be enough. It was not. In a world that prized endurance over empathy, her gentleness became a liability. Long before the phone stopped ringing, long before roles disappeared, the conditions for her erasure were already in place, invisible but relentless. Her disappearance began long before history noticed, recorded, or remembered. Gail Russell did not fear failure in the way Hollywood usually defines it. She was not terrified of forgetting lines or disappointing directors. What unsettled her was something more basic and far more relentless: being seen, being watched, being evaluated. Long before cameras rolled, anxiety had already claimed its territory inside her, shaping how she moved, spoke, and breathed. For Gail Russell, attention was not a reward. It was a threat that arrived without warning and never fully left. Film sets magnified that fear. Bright lights, crowded rooms, and the awareness of dozens of eyes fixed on her body and voice triggered panic rather than excitement. Where others found adrenaline, she found paralysis. Each performance required her to override instincts that screamed for retreat. Hollywood had no language for this kind of distress. There were no conversations about mental health, no vocabulary for anxiety beyond weakness or temperament. She was expected to adjust, endure, and remain professional. The burden of adaptation fell entirely on her, even as the environment itself became unbearable. Gail had no psychological armor. She had not been taught how to compartmentalize fear or convert pressure into momentum. Instead, she absorbed everything. Criticism lingered longer than praise. Anticipation felt heavier than accomplishment. The very structure of her work demanded repeated exposure to the stimulus that frightened her most. Each role meant returning to the same conditions, hoping this time the fear would loosen its grip. It rarely did. Survival required constant effort, and that effort was invisible to those around her. Hollywood interpreted her struggle through a narrow lens. Nervousness was tolerated only if it remained invisible. Anxiety was acceptable only if it did not interrupt schedules. The industry did not ask why a young woman might be unraveling under such scrutiny. It simply measured whether she could still function. As long as scenes were completed and footage delivered, the internal cost remained irrelevant. This silent arrangement placed Gail in an impossible position. Her job depended on repeatedly confronting the very thing that was eroding her sense of self. She was born into an era that did not yet acknowledge emotional fragility as something deserving care. Sensitivity was not protected. It was exploited or dismissed. There were no safeguards, no structured support, and no pause for recovery. Gail learned to live in a state of constant anticipation, bracing herself for the next wave of exposure. Over time, fear stopped being episodic and became ambient, a background presence shaping every decision she made. What makes this tragedy heavier is how ordinary it appeared from the outside. There was no public breakdown, no dramatic refusal to perform, just a woman quietly tightening under pressure, doing everything required of her while losing ground internally. Hollywood continued forward, interpreting silence as compliance. In that silence, Gail Russell learned that endurance was expected, not compassion. And the longer she endured, the less visible her struggle became. By the time anxiety began to dictate her choices entirely, the system had already accepted her distress as normal. Fear did not end her career in one decisive moment. It wore her down gradually, until existing within Hollywood felt like a constant state of siege. Gail Russell did not turn to alcohol out of rebellion or excess. There was nothing glamorous about it, nothing defiant. At first, it was simply a way to remain upright in a world that demanded constant exposure. Alcohol softened the edge of fear, slowed the racing thoughts, steadied the hands just enough for her to speak lines and finish scenes. It was not an escape from Hollywood. It was the price of continuing to function inside it. Without it, the anxiety surged unchecked. With it, she could at least appear composed. What makes this chapter so devastating is how ordinary it felt to everyone else. No one forced a glass into her hand. No contract required it. Yet the entire system benefited when she drank. When the alcohol worked, Gail could perform. When she could perform, production stayed on schedule. Scenes were completed, costs were controlled, appearances were preserved. The mechanism was simple and deeply unethical. As long as the result existed, the method did not matter. Her drinking was treated as a private weakness, even as it became an unspoken requirement for her continued usefulness. Alcohol functioned like invisible makeup, covering what Hollywood did not want to confront. It hid the shaking, the panic, the hesitation. It allowed the illusion of normalcy to continue. Directors saw a workable actress. Studios saw a manageable asset. Few, if any, asked what it was costing her internally. In an industry that prizes output above all else, functionality becomes morality. If something works, it is tolerated. If it stops working, it is discarded. Gail Russell was allowed to drink because it solved a problem Hollywood did not want to solve properly. Over time, the boundary between survival and dependence dissolved. The substance that once made performance possible began to hollow her out. Physical resilience weakened. Emotional regulation eroded. What had been a coping mechanism turned into a condition that demanded its own maintenance. Yet Hollywood's response did not change. Concern surfaced only when reliability declined. The question was never whether she was suffering, but whether she was still controllable. Compassion entered the conversation too late, and even then, it was conditional. This is where responsibility becomes impossible to ignore. When a system quietly rewards behavior that destroys a person, can it claim innocence simply because no one issued a direct order? Gail was not encouraged to stop. She was encouraged to deliver. As long as she could meet expectations, her method of survival remained invisible. When she could no longer maintain that balance, the tolerance evaporated. What had once been ignored became unacceptable overnight. Alcohol did not ruin Gail Russell's career in a dramatic collapse. It eroded it slowly, mirroring the way her fear had eroded her sense of safety. Hollywood did not intervene, because intervention would have required acknowledgement. It would have meant admitting that the system itself contributed to the damage. Instead, silence prevailed. The industry watched the symptoms worsen and adjusted its distance accordingly. In the end, alcohol was not the scandal. It was the evidence of a system that mistook endurance for health, productivity for well-being, and survival for consent. Gail Russell drank to remain visible, and when visibility became impossible, the system that had benefited from her survival quietly stepped away. Gail Russell was never a mystery to Hollywood. Her anxiety was visible. Her dependence on alcohol was whispered about, then quietly accepted. Her growing fragility was noted, documented, and ultimately filed away as a personal complication. The studios knew exactly what was happening. What defines this chapter is not ignorance, but the deliberate choice to treat knowledge as inconvenience rather than responsibility. In the studio era, care ended where productivity began. As long as an actor could deliver usable footage, personal suffering remained outside the scope of obligation. Gail's distress did not immediately disrupt schedules, so it was categorized as manageable. No one intervened because nothing had yet broken down in a way that forced action. The system operated on a simple calculation. If the machine continued to function, there was no justification to slow it down. Human cost was not measured unless it threatened efficiency. This created a dangerous illusion of neutrality. Hollywood did not explicitly force Gail Russell to keep working, but it constructed an environment in which stopping was indistinguishable from failure. To pause meant becoming a liability. To ask for help meant admitting instability. Silence, on the other hand, was rewarded. Endurance was praised. Each completed role reinforced the belief that everything was under control, even as her internal world deteriorated. In this way, the system trained its most vulnerable figures to disappear quietly rather than disrupt the flow. When Gail's ability to remain composed began to slip, the response was not compassion but recalibration. The studios did not confront the issue directly. They adjusted around it. Opportunities narrowed. Roles grew less frequent. Invitations slowed, then stopped. No explanation was offered because explanations create accountability. Distance was easier. It allowed the industry to maintain the appearance of decency while withdrawing support piece by piece. This is the cruelty of institutional silence. There was no dramatic firing, no public scandal that might have exposed the system's role. Instead, there was absence. Absence of calls. Absence of concern. Absence of voice. Gail Russell was not expelled from Hollywood. She was quietly excluded. The phone stopped ringing, and nothing replaced it. In a culture where visibility equals existence, disappearance is the cleanest erasure of all. Hollywood protected itself by framing her decline as personal tragedy rather than structural consequence. By doing so, it preserved moral distance. It could express sympathy without assuming responsibility, concern without action. Gail became a cautionary footnote instead of evidence. Her suffering was individualized, even though it unfolded within a system that consumed her vulnerability while offering no protection in return. The studio system demanded total availability but denied obligation. It required emotional exposure without providing safety. It absorbed fragility as long as it remained functional, then rejected it once it became inconvenient. Gail Russell was not punished for rebellion or defiance. She was abandoned for no longer operating within acceptable limits. The silence that followed was not accidental, it was procedural. Once she was no longer reliably usable, she no longer required management. She required forgetting. Hollywood did not need to destroy her career in a single decisive act. It simply withdrew its attention. And in an industry where attention determines survival, withdrawal becomes a sentence. This is the system that looked away, not because it did not see, but because seeing would have required change. And change, in Hollywood, was always more dangerous than silence. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Gail Russell might not have to face Hollywood entirely alone. That moment arrived in the form of John Wayne, a man who represented everything she was not. Where Gail was quiet, Wayne was commanding. Where she shrank under attention, he dominated it. He was power, certainty, and institutional protection made flesh. If anyone in Hollywood could shield someone from the industry's indifference, it was him. Their connection was never a spectacle. There were no carefully staged appearances, no publicity-driven romance, no headlines designed to sell an image. What existed between them was subdued, private, and deeply un-Hollywood. Wayne cared for Gail in ways that did not require performance. He saw her vulnerability not as a flaw to manage, but as something to be guarded. In an industry built on transaction, this alone made their bond unusual. But affection is not the same as rescue, and concern does not automatically translate into salvation. Wayne could offer protection from external pressures, but Gail's greatest struggle lived inside her. Anxiety, fear, and dependence did not respond to authority or reassurance. They were not enemies that could be confronted or defeated. They were conditions that required understanding, patience, and tools that did not exist in her world. This is where the illusion of rescue collapses. Hollywood often tells stories where love intervenes at the final moment, where a powerful figure steps in and changes the outcome. Gail Russell's life refused that narrative. Wayne could slow the damage. He could create moments of safety. He could care. But he could not rewire a system that rewarded silence, nor could he undo the years of internal erosion that had already taken root. Their distance did not arrive through betrayal or dramatic rupture. It emerged gradually, shaped by helplessness rather than conflict. When someone cannot be saved in the way you hope, closeness becomes painful. Effort turns into frustration. Concern turns into exhaustion. What remained was not rejection, but the quiet realization that even good intentions have limits. The presence of John Wayne in Gail Russell's story makes the tragedy heavier, not lighter. It eliminates the easy explanation that she had no one. She was not unloved. She was not invisible to everyone. And yet, love proved insufficient. Care existed without cure. Protection existed without permanence. This distinction matters because it reveals how deeply the problem extended beyond personal relationships. If the most powerful man in Hollywood could not shield her from the system or from herself, then the failure cannot be reduced to individual choices. It exposes the era's blindness toward mental fragility and the impossibility of recovery within an environment that offered no space for it. Wayne represented strength, but strength alone could not address what Gail needed. Hollywood prefers to believe that salvation is a matter of proximity to power. Gail Russell's story dismantles that belief. She stood near power and still fell through the cracks. Her connection to Wayne did not save her because it was never designed to. The system did not change. The expectations did not soften, and the silence did not break. In the end, John Wayne remains in her story not as a savior, but as evidence. Evidence that compassion can exist and still fail. Evidence that love does not always arrive with solutions. and evidence that some tragedies are not caused by the absence of care, but by the absence of structures capable of sustaining it. Gail Russell did not lose her chance at rescue. The rescue she needed was never available. Gail Russell did not leave Hollywood in flames. There was no lawsuit, no public accusation, no explosive final act that forced the industry to reckon with its role. Her exit lacked spectacle, and that absence became the defining reason she was never fully remembered. Hollywood is comfortable with scandal because scandal creates a narrative. Gail Russell offered none. She did not fight the system publicly. She did not demand explanations or claim injustice. There were no interviews exposing cruelty behind the studio gates, no dramatic refusals that might have turned her into a symbol of resistance. Silence followed her departure, and silence is easy to ignore. In an industry built on noise, those who leave quietly are the easiest to forget. This absence of conflict worked against her. History tends to preserve those who disrupt it. Stars who rage, collapse, or burn brightly at the end are given context, sympathy, and space in collective memory. Gail Russell did none of that. Her decline unfolded without confrontation, without spectacle, and without a single moment that demanded attention. As a result, she slipped through the cracks of Hollywood's own storytelling. The studio system prefers clean endings. When a career ends without mess, responsibility dissolves. There is nothing to defend against, nothing to explain. Gail's disappearance could be framed as unfortunate but natural, tragic but inevitable. Without a scandal to anchor the story, there was no incentive to revisit the conditions that led to her erasure. Forgetting became the most efficient response. What makes this especially cruel is that Gail's silence was not a strategy. It was consistent with who she had always been. She did not possess the temperament for confrontation. She had no appetite for public struggle. Even in pain, she remained inward. That inwardness, once admired on screen, became a liability when she no longer served the industry's needs. Without an iconic final role to preserve her image, Gail Russell lacked the usual anchors that secure a star's legacy. There was no definitive performance to return to, no triumphant last chapter that might have reframed her story. Her career did not end with reinvention or reintegration. It simply stopped. And when something stops quietly, history rarely pauses to ask why. Hollywood remembers disruption. It remembers rebellion. It remembers excess. It does not remember those who fade without resistance. Gail Russell's tragedy was not only that she suffered, but that she did so without spectacle. In doing so, she became the kind of casualty history struggles to hold on to. This is how erasure works, not through punishment, but through omission, not through condemnation, but through neglect. Gail Russell was not written out of Hollywood with malice. She was written out through disinterest. And once written out, she remained absent from the narratives that shape cultural memory. Her story challenges the assumption that being remembered is a function of importance. Often, it is a function of noise. Gail made none. She did not disrupt. She did not accuse. She did not leave behind a mess large enough to demand explanation. And so her life became a footnote rather than a reckoning. In the end, Gail Russell was not protected by history because she never forced history to notice her departure. Her silence became the final condition of her disappearance, and that silence, more than any scandal, sealed her erasure. By the time Gail Russell died, Hollywood had already finished with her. There were no cameras waiting, no colleagues rushing in, no industry voices scrambling to explain what went wrong. Her death did not interrupt production schedules or provoke uncomfortable conversations. It simply confirmed what the silence had already decided. Gail Russell's story forces an unsettling question. How many lives were quietly consumed without ever producing a scandal? Her tragedy was not sudden, and it was not spectacular. It was slow, procedural, and largely invisible. That is why it matters. She represents those who were too sensitive for an era that rewarded endurance over care, obedience over honesty, and productivity over humanity. She did not fail to survive Hollywood. Hollywood failed to imagine survival for someone like her. Remembering Gail Russell is not about nostalgia or pity. It is about recognizing the cost of systems that mistake silence for consent and disappearance for resolution. Her life warns us that harm does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives politely, through neglect, routine, and indifference. Hollywood moved on. History did too. The only way her story survives is if we choose to keep telling it, not as gossip, but as evidence.